The transport ship Meridian's edge shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning under the stress of deceleration. Through the reinforced viewport of the cargo bay, the blue-green marble of Kepler 442b hung suspended against the starfield like a promise of redemption. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his scarred palm against the cool metal bulkhead and watched the planet grow larger, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in his chest.
Final approach in 30 minutes, the ship's AI announced in its perfectly modulated tone. All colonist personnel report to designated assembly areas.
Marcus shouldered his duffel bag, the same one that had followed him through 3 tours on the Martian frontier and 2 years in the Veterans Rehabilitation Center on Europa. Everything he owned in the universe fit into that worn canvas sack: a few changes of clothes, his grandfather's compass, his discharge papers, and a bottle of pills he hadn't touched in 6 months. The pills rattled softly as he walked, a sound that once might have sent him reaching for the bottle but now served as a reminder of how far he'd come.
The assembly area buzzed with nervous energy.
250 carefully selected colonists, each one a specialist in their field, each one essential to the success of humanity's first permanent settlement beyond the Sol system. Xenobiologists, engineers, doctors, farmers, teachers, the best and brightest that Earth had to offer. And then, there was Marcus, the damaged soldier they'd accepted only after 3 other security candidates had withdrawn from the program. Dr. Sarah Voss, the mission's chief administrator, stood at the front of the crowd with her tablet in hand. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn during the selection interviews, and her pale blue eyes swept across the assembled colonists with clinical efficiency. When her gaze found Marcus, it lingered for just a moment longer than the others, and he caught the subtle tightening around her eyes that told him everything he needed to know about her opinion of his presence here. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Voss began, her voice carrying easily across the bay, "in approximately 25 minutes, we will begin our descent to the surface of New Eden. I want to remind everyone that the initial survey teams have established a basic perimeter, but we should consider this planet largely unexplored.
Standard protocols will be in effect at all times."
Marcus half listened to the briefing, his attention drifting to the massive cargo containers that lined the bay walls. Prefabricated habitat modules, agricultural equipment, medical supplies, communication arrays, everything needed to carve out a foothold on an alien world. It was ambitious to the point of recklessness, this plan to establish a self-sustaining colony so far from Earth. The nearest help was 8 years away at light speed, assuming anyone back home was still willing to send it. The war had changed everything. The Sino-European conflict had raged for 6 years, consuming resources and lives with mechanical efficiency. Earth's colonies in the Sol system had been abandoned or left to fend for themselves as the military-industrial complex devoured every available ship, every trained pilot, every gram of refined uranium. By the time the ceasefire was signed, humanity had a choice: turn inward and spend the next century rebuilding, or reach outward toward the stars and hope that distance might provide the fresh start that proximity had failed to deliver.
The New Eden Initiative was born from that desperate optimism.
A joint venture between the remnants of the old United Nations and a consortium of private corporations, it represented humanity's first serious attempt at interstellar colonization. The fact that they were willing to include someone with Marcus's psychological profile spoke volumes about either their desperation or their faith in second chances.
He still wasn't sure which it was. "Sergeant Chen," Dr. Voss's voice cut through his reverie.
"A word, please." Marcus made his way through the crowd of colonists, noting how they unconsciously shifted to give him space. It wasn't fear, exactly. His medical records were sealed, and most of them knew only that he was their designated security chief. But there was something in his bearing, something in the careful way he moved and the way his dark eyes constantly scanned for threats, that marked him as different from the scientists and technicians around him. Dr. Voss led him to a quiet corner of the bay, her expression neutral but tense.
"I want to be clear about something, Sergeant. I opposed your inclusion in this mission from the beginning.
The selection committee overruled me, but that doesn't mean I've changed my opinion."
Marcus nodded slowly. He'd expected this conversation eventually. "Understood, ma'am. Is there something specific you'd like me to address?"
"Your psychological evaluation raised several red flags.
Post-traumatic stress, anger management issues, substance abuse.
The recommending psychiatrist noted significant improvement, but improvement isn't the same as cure. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper.
These people are depending on me to keep them safe. I need to know that you won't become a liability.
The old Marcus would have bristled at the accusation, would have let his temper flare and proven her point in the process. But that Marcus had died in a military hospital on Europa, suffocated slowly by his own shame and self-pity. The man who stood before Dr. Voss now had been forged in the crucible of recovery, tempered by months of therapy and honest self-examination.
Dr. Voss, I understand your concerns, and I respect your responsibility to the mission. I can't prove to you that I changed, proof only comes with time and consistency. But I can tell you that I didn't come here to run away from my problems. I came here to be useful again. He met her gaze steadily. The man who let his squad down on Mars isn't the man standing in front of you. That person had to die before this one could live. Dr. Voss studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Very well. But understand that I'll be watching, Sergeant. One incident, just one, and I'll have you confined to quarters for the remainder of the mission. Fair enough. The landing went smoothly, the transport's atmospheric thrusters firing in sequence as they descended through New Eden's surprisingly Earth-like sky. Marcus strapped himself into a jump seat and watched through the porthole as alien terrain rushed past below. Vast forests of what the survey team had dubbed crystal trees, towering structures that seemed to be part plant and part mineral, their translucent branches catching and refracting the light of New Eden's binary suns. Rivers carved silver ribbons through rolling hills covered in something that looked like purple grass but moved with its own internal rhythm, swaying in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind. The preliminary surveys had confirmed New Eden's remarkable compatibility with human life. Breathable atmosphere, gravity 95% of Earth normal, abundant fresh water, and a 26-hour day cycle that would require minimal adjustment. It was as close to a perfect world as humanity had any right to expect, which was part of what made the discovery so unsettling. Perfect planets shouldn't exist, especially not in systems that showed clear signs of artificial manipulation. The transport touched down on a cleared landing zone adjacent to the nascent colony. Through the speakers, Marcus could hear the engines winding down and the soft hiss of the atmosphere equalizers. Home, for better or worse. The first few weeks passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Habitat modules were assembled and connected, creating a growing network of corridors and chambers that gradually began to resemble a real settlement. The agricultural dome went up first, its transparent walls filled with the green promise of Earth crops adapting to alien soil. The medical facility followed, then, the workshops and laboratories where the colony's scientists would begin the long process of understanding their new world. Marcus threw himself into the work with the focused intensity that had once made him an effective soldier. He coordinated security protocols, established patrol routes, and trained volunteer colonists in basic defensive procedures. It felt good to have a purpose again, to feel the weight of responsibility without the crushing burden of guilt that had defined his previous command experience. But, as the colony took shape, so did the questions that the survey teams had been asking for months. New Eden was too perfect, too convenient. The crystal trees arranged themselves in patterns that suggested cultivation rather than natural growth. The rivers flowed in mathematically precise curves that maximized coverage of the continent's arable land. Even the weather seemed designed for optimal agricultural conditions, with regular precipitation cycles that arrived with clockwork precision. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's chief xenobiologist, spent her days cataloging the planet's flora and fauna with growing bewilderment. It's like someone took Earth's biosphere and optimized it, she explained to Marcus during one of his routine security checks of the research lab. Every species we've identified fills a specific ecological niche with almost mechanical efficiency. There are no redundancies, no evolutionary dead ends, no extinct species in the fossil record. Marcus watched her work through the laboratory's reinforced windows, noting the careful way she handled each specimen. Dr. Vasquez was young for her position, maybe 35, with the kind of intense focus that marked someone who had dedicated their life to understanding the universe's mysteries.
Her dark eyes held a mixture of excitement and unease that Marcus had seen before, usually in soldiers who had stumbled across something that didn't belong on a battlefield.
"What's your theory?" he asked. "That's just it. I don't have one that makes sense."
The level of organization we're seeing would require either impossible coincidence or deliberate intervention by an intelligence far beyond anything in the historical record. She gestured toward a tank containing what appeared to be a cross between a butterfly and a solar panel, its wings covered in organic photovoltaic cells. This little beauty converts sunlight directly into usable energy and deposits it in specialized root structures throughout the forest.
It's biological technology that's at least a century ahead of anything we've developed.
The implications hung in the air between them like a physical presence.
If New Eden had been deliberately engineered, where were the engineers?
The survey teams had found no signs of current habitation, no ruins, no artifacts, nothing to suggest that an advanced civilization had ever existed on the planet's surface.
Yet the evidence of intelligent design was overwhelming.
Marcus was pondering these mysteries 3 weeks later when the proximity alarms began screaming throughout the colony. He was in his quarters, reviewing security protocols for the mining operation that was scheduled to begin the following month, when the urgent tone sent him racing toward the command center. His training kicked in automatically, muscle memory guiding him through the corridors as his mind cataloged potential threats. Asteroid impact, equipment failure, attack by unknown forces, a dozen scenarios flickered through his consciousness as he ran. The command center was chaos when he arrived. Dr. Voss stood at the central console, her usually composed demeanor cracking under stress as she barked orders at the technicians around her. Multiple screens showed feeds from the colony's external sensors, and Marcus felt his blood chill as he processed what he was seeing. Ships. Dozens of them, sleek and angular, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. They hung motionless above New Eden's atmosphere like predatory birds, their hull designs unlike anything in humanity's databases. The largest was easily 3 times the size of the transport that had brought them here, its surface a dark metallic gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it.
"Have they made contact?" Marcus asked, moving to Dr. Voss's side. "Nothing. They've been sitting there for 20 minutes, not responding to our communications."
Her voice was tight with controlled panic.
"We tried every frequency, every protocol in the book. They're just watching."
Marcus studied the tactical display, his military training automatically cataloging the alien fleet's positioning and capabilities. The formation was clearly deliberate, designed to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining escape routes. These weren't explorers or diplomats, they were soldiers.
"Ma'am, I recommend we initiate lockdown procedures immediately.
Get everyone into the hardened shelters and prepare for possible evacuation."
Dr. Voss nodded sharply. "Do it. And, Sergeant,
I hope you're as good at this as your file suggests." The colony's alarm system shifted from proximity warnings to emergency lockdown as Marcus coordinated the civilian response. 250 scared scientists and technicians moved with surprising efficiency toward the underground shelters that had been constructed for exactly this scenario. The plan had always been optimistic. If a hostile force with interstellar capability wanted to destroy the colony, there was little that Marcus and his improvised security force could do to stop them. But plans gave people something to focus on besides their fear, and sometimes that was enough. As the last of the civilians disappeared into the shelter complex, Marcus made his way to the colony's communications array.
If these aliens wanted to talk, he would be ready.
If they wanted to fight, he would buy the colonists as much time as possible.
It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the one he had.
The communications console crackled to life as he settled into the operator's chair. A voice spoke in accented but perfectly clear English, transmitted from somewhere in the fleet above.
"Human settlement, this is Commander Thalnara of the Kethvar Alliance.
You will prepare to receive a diplomatic party immediately.
Non-compliance will be interpreted as hostile intent."
Marcus keyed the transmitter, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins.
"Commander Thalnara, this is Sergeant Marcus Chen of the New Eden colony. We're prepared to receive your diplomatic party under standard protocols. Please state your intentions."
A long pause followed,
filled only by the static of interstellar distances. When the voice returned, there was something different in its tone, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Sergeant Chen. You are a warrior." It wasn't a question, and Marcus found himself answering before he fully understood why. "I am." "Then, you will understand the gravity of what I must tell you. Your species has claimed a world that is not yours to claim. The entity that created this place has awakened, and it is displeased." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The entity that created this place. So their suspicions had been correct. New Eden was artificial, engineered by some intelligence that apparently still existed somewhere in the galaxy. And now humanity had wandered into its garden uninvited. "Commander, we had no knowledge of any prior claim to this world. Our surveys detected no signs of current habitation or artificial structures. If we've made an error, we're willing to discuss relocation or shared usage agreements." The alien's laughter came through the speakers like broken glass. "You speak of relocation as though you have a choice in the matter. The gardener tolerates no unauthorized presence in its domains. Your only options are immediate departure or elimination." Marcus felt the familiar calm that came with accepting an impossible situation. There was no retreat. The transport ship that had brought them here wouldn't return for another 18 months, and even if they could somehow jury-rig a faster-than-light drive from colony equipment, they couldn't abandon 2 years of work and the dream of a new beginning without a fight. "I need to speak with my people," he said carefully. "How long do we have?" "The gardener's patience extends precisely 72 of your hours. Use that time wisely, Sergeant Chen." The transmission cut off, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of an impossible decision. Outside the communications center, New Eden's twin suns were setting, painting the alien sky in shades of gold and crimson that no human eyes had witnessed before yesterday. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with loss for something he'd barely had time to appreciate. Dr. Voss emerged from the shelter complex 30 minutes later, her face pale but determined. She found Marcus in the communications center, staring at readouts that told him everything and nothing about the alien fleet hanging above their heads. "Report," she said simply. Marcus gave her the facts without embellishment, watching her composure crack slightly as the implications sank in. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. 72 hours, she said finally. "Not much time to pack up 2 years of work. Ma'am, with respect, I don't think that's our only option." Dr. Voss turned to look at him, and Marcus saw something in her expression that he hadn't expected, hope, fragile but real. "What are you suggesting, Sergeant?" "I'm suggesting that we don't have enough information to make a rational decision. This Commander Thelnara mentioned an entity called the Gardener, but we still don't know what that means or where it is. The Kethvar Alliance is clearly advanced enough for interstellar travel, but they're talking to us instead of simply destroying us, which suggests either weakness or uncertainty on their part." Marcus stood up, his mind working through possibilities like a chess player considering moves. "I think there's more going on here than we understand. And I think our best chance of survival lies in understanding it." "You want to negotiate. I want to gather intelligence. Real intelligence, not the second-hand threats and ultimatums we're getting from these Kethvar." He met her gaze steadily. "Dr. Voss, I know you don't trust me, and I understand why. But my whole career was built on finding ways to win battles that couldn't be won through conventional means. Give me a chance to do what I'm good at." Dr. Voss was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the same clinical intensity she brought to all her decisions. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need?" "Time, mostly. And access to all the geological and archaeological data we've collected since landfall. If this gardener really did engineer New Eden, there have to be traces of its presence somewhere on the planet. We just haven't looked in the right places yet." The next 18 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Marcus coordinated with Dr. Vasquez and the geological team to identify anomalous readings that might indicate artificial structures or technology. They found dozens of candidates, metallic deposits in impossible configurations, energy signatures that didn't match any known natural phenomena, geological formations that defied conventional explanations.
But it was Dr. James Harrison, a quiet archaeologist who specialized in xenocultural analysis, who made the breakthrough. He'd been studying the pattern of crystal tree growth across the continent, noting how their placement seemed to follow mathematical principles rather than biological ones. When he overlaid the growth patterns with the colony's geological survey data, a picture began to emerge. "It's a map," he explained to the assembled leadership team, his voice tight with excitement. "The entire crystal forest is actually a three-dimensional representation of something. Look at this." The holographic display in the conference room shifted to show New Eden's continent from above, with the crystal trees highlighted in blue. From this perspective, their arrangement was clearly artificial, a complex geometric pattern that spiraled outward from a central point approximately 200 kilometers south of the colony. "The focal point shows massive energy signatures," Dr. Harrison continued. "Whatever's down there, it's been dormant since we arrived, but the readings suggest technology on a scale we can barely comprehend." Marcus studied the display, his tactical mind automatically assessing approach routes and defensive positions. The central point was located in a region that the survey teams had classified as difficult terrain, a series of interconnected canyons carved into ancient bedrock. If something was hidden there, it had been hidden well. "How long would it take to reach that location?" he asked. "Overland? Maybe 6 hours by hover transport, assuming we could navigate the canyon system safely." Dr. Voss leaned forward, her expression skeptical. "Sergeant, surely you're not suggesting we approach what might be an alien installation with hostile intent toward humanity?" "Actually, that's exactly what I'm suggesting." Marcus turned to face her, his voice calm but determined. "Ma'am, we have 48 hours before this ultimatum expires. We can spend that time packing our bags and hoping these Kethvar are reasonable people, or we can spend it trying to understand what we're really dealing with. If there's technology down there that created New Eden, it might be advanced enough to level the playing field. Or it might kill us all the moment we approach it. Maybe. But, Dr. Voss, we're going to die anyway if we can't find a solution to this problem. The transport that brought us here won't return for 18 months. Even if we could somehow signal for pickup, there's no guarantee that Earth has ships available for evacuation. We're on our own out here." The room fell silent as the weight of their isolation settled over the leadership team. 250 people, 8 light-years from home, facing an ultimatum from aliens who claimed to speak for some godlike entity that had shaped their new world. When Marcus put it that way, approaching a potentially hostile alien installation seemed almost reasonable by comparison. Dr. Voss was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the conference table as she weighed their options. Finally, she looked up at Marcus with something that might have been respect. "Very well, Sergeant. But I'm not sending you alone. If we're going to risk contact with this gardener, we need a full scientific team to document whatever we find." Marcus shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, this is a reconnaissance mission into potentially hostile territory. The smaller the team, the better our chances of getting in and out safely. Sergeant Chen, you're forgetting something important." Dr. Vasquez spoke up from her position near the door, her dark eyes bright with determination. "You're a soldier, not a scientist. If we encounter alien technology, you'll need someone who can actually understand what they're looking at." The debate continued for another hour, but eventually they reached a compromise. Marcus would lead a 4-person team to investigate the central point, himself, Dr. Vasquez, Dr. Harrison, and communications specialist Lu Wei. Small enough to move quickly and avoid detection, large enough to handle basic scientific analysis and maintain contact with the colony. They departed at dawn, traveling south through alien landscape in one of the colony's hover transports. Marcus drove while Dr. Vasquez navigated, the vehicle's repulsors humming quietly as they skimmed over terrain that shifted from purple grasslands to crystalline forests to the broken rocky badlands that surrounded their destination. The closer they got to the central point, the more apparent it became that New Eden's ecosystem was artificial. The transitions between different biomes were too abrupt, too mathematically precise. It was like traveling through a vast garden where each section had been carefully designed for optimal beauty and efficiency. "Look at this," Dr. Harrison called out from the rear of the transport, pointing toward a series of hills that rose from the grasslands like perfectly formed sculptures.
Those aren't natural formations.
The erosion patterns are all wrong, and the mineral composition doesn't match the surrounding geology. Marcus glanced in the direction Harrison was pointing and felt a chill run down his spine. The hills did look artificial, but more than that, they looked familiar.
The curved surfaces and flowing lines reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place what.
It wasn't until they reached the edge of the canyon system that it hit him. The hills, the crystal trees, even the shape of the continent itself, they were all variations on the same basic design aesthetic.
Organic curves blended with geometric precision, beauty married to function in ways that spoke of an intelligence that was both alien and oddly comprehensible.
It's architecture, he said suddenly.
The whole planet is architecture. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her instruments, startled by the certainty in his voice. What do you mean?
I mean, this isn't just a garden, it's a work of art. Someone or something designed New Eden not just for optimal habitability, but for beauty. For the pure aesthetic pleasure of creating something perfect. The implications of that realization followed them into the canyons, where the transport's lights carved tunnels through darkness that felt older than human civilization. The walls around them were smooth and curved, carved from living rock with a precision that spoke of tools beyond human comprehension. And everywhere, faintly visible in the reflected glow of their passage, were symbols. Dr. Harrison was the first to notice them, calling for Marcus to stop the transport so he could examine the wall carvings more closely. The symbols were beautiful in their alien complexity, flowing lines that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of view, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly but resolved into meaning when observed peripherally.
It's a language, Harrison whispered, his voice filled with awe. But not like any language I've ever seen.
These symbols aren't just representing concepts, they're actually embodying them somehow.
Look at this. He pointed to a particularly complex symbol that seemed to pulse with its own internal light.
As Marcus watched, the symbol's meaning became clear in his mind without any conscious process of translation.
Gardener.
The entity that had shaped this world, that had turned dead rock into living paradise.
How are we reading this? Lu Wei asked, her voice tight with nervousness. We don't have any translation software for alien languages.
Dr. Vasquez was studying her instruments with growing excitement.
Because it's not really a language in the traditional sense.
These symbols are generating some kind of neural resonance field, they're bypassing our language centers and communicating directly with our consciousness. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the canyon's cool air. Technology that could communicate directly with human minds was beyond anything in their experience, beyond anything they had theoretical frameworks to understand. They were walking through the work of a civilization that had transcended normal definitions of advancement. The central chamber, when they finally reached it, defied every expectation Marcus had formed during their journey. He had anticipated an alien control room, banks of incomprehensible technology, perhaps a massive computer core that managed New Eden's biosphere.
Instead, they found a garden. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that their lights couldn't penetrate.
The floor was covered in something that looked like grass but felt like silk beneath their feet, and the air was filled with the soft sound of running water and the gentle rustle of leaves. Scattered throughout the space were trees that seemed to be made of living crystal, their branches bearing fruit that glowed with soft, warm light. At the center of it all stood a figure that might have been human if humans were made of starlight and dreams. The entity that called itself the gardener was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's eyes water and his heart ache with impossible longing. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with features that seemed to shift and flow like water while maintaining an essential coherence that spoke of vast intelligence and boundless compassion. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating inside their skulls like the memory of music. You have come far to stand in my garden, children of Earth. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her scientific training warring with the awe that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind.
Are you the one who created this world? The gardener's expression might have been amusement. Created? No.
I am the one who tends it, who shapes it, who loves it into the form it was always meant to take. This world was dying when I found it, poisoned by the ambitions of its former inhabitants. I gave it new life, new purpose. The Kethvar Alliance claims you're angry about our presence here, Marcus said, finding his voice despite the otherworldly atmosphere.
They've given us 72 hours to leave or face elimination.
The gardener turned its attention to Marcus, and he felt the weight of a gaze that seemed to penetrate to the very core of his being. For a moment, he was certain that every secret, every shame, every moment of weakness in his entire life was laid bare before this cosmic intelligence. But, instead of judgment, he sensed only a deep, abiding sadness. The Kethvar speak truly, but not completely. I am not angry about your presence, I am grieved by your need. You came here fleeing the wounds your species has inflicted upon itself, seeking a new beginning among the stars. But, you brought your pain with you, Marcus Chen, and pain has a way of growing if it is not properly tended. Marcus felt his composure crack slightly at the casual way the gardener spoke his name, at the gentle acknowledgement of the trauma he'd worked so hard to overcome.
I don't understand.
Your species stands at a crossroads, as mine once did. You can continue down the path of violence and division that brought you to this place of exile, or you can choose to become something greater.
But that choice cannot be made for you, it must come from within. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his archaeological instincts overriding his fear. What happened to your species? You speak of them in the past tense.
The gardener's form seemed to flicker, becoming somehow less substantial.
We made our choice long ago. We chose transcendence over physical existence, unity over individual consciousness.
What you see before you is all that remains of what we once were, a single consciousness tasked with preserving the beauty we learned to create before we moved beyond the need for form.
And the Kethvar? Marcus asked.
A younger race, still struggling with the same questions that once consumed us. They have achieved great technological advancement, but they remain trapped by their own limitations, their own fears. They see your potential and are threatened by it, as we once were threatened by theirs.
The implications hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. This is a test. You're using us to test them. The gardener's expression might have been approval. You understand quickly, Marcus Chen. The Kethvar claim dominion over this region of space, but dominion without wisdom is merely tyranny.
They must learn to see beyond their own perspective, to recognize the value in diversity, in the contributions that other species can make to the greater garden of existence.
And, if they fail? Dr. Vasquez asked.
Then, they will have chosen their path, as we chose ours.
The gardener's voice carried infinite sadness.
The universe is vast enough to accommodate many different forms of consciousness, but it has no place for those who would deny that same right to others. Marcus felt the pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place in his mind.
You want us to refuse their ultimatum. To stand and fight.
I want you to choose, freely and, without coercion, what kind of species you wish to become. The Kethvar believe that might makes right, that technological superiority grants them the authority to determine the fate of younger civilizations. But, you, Marcus Chen, you have learned something they have not yet discovered.
What's that?
The gardener stepped closer, and Marcus caught a scent like ozone and growing things, like the moment after a thunderstorm when the whole world smells new and clean. You have learned that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy others, but from the willingness to destroy the parts of yourself that prevent growth. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already become something greater than what they sought to defeat. The words hit Marcus with the force of revelation. His journey from broken soldier to functional human being hadn't been about forgetting his past or denying his failures, it had been about acknowledging them, understanding them, and choosing to become something better. The process of healing had required him to confront the worst parts of himself and transform them into sources of strength rather than shame. You're saying that our species needs to do the same thing on a larger scale. I am saying that every species faces this choice eventually. The Kethvar have not yet learned to destroy their weak selves, their fear, their need to dominate, their inability to see beyond their own perspective. Until they do, they will remain trapped in patterns of behavior that limit their potential for growth. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her scientific mind working to understand the implications of what they were hearing.
If we refuse to leave, if we stand up to them, what happens then?
The gardener's form began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. Then, you will discover what you are truly capable of becoming. The garden will provide what tools it can, but the choice of how to use them will be yours alone. As the entity dissolved into streams of light that flowed back into the crystal trees, Marcus felt a familiar sensation, the weight of command settling onto his shoulders, the responsibility for other lives that had once nearly destroyed him. But, this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't carrying the weight alone. The journey back to the colony passed in thoughtful silence, each member of the team lost in contemplation of what they had experienced. By the time they reached the settlement, Marcus had made his decision. As they approached the communications center, he found Dr. Voss waiting for them, her expression tight with anxiety. "Report, Sergeant." Marcus looked around at the colony that had become home, at the people who had trusted him with their safety despite his past failures, at the alien sky that promised either destruction or transformation. When he spoke, his voice was calm and certain.
"Ma'am, I recommend we refuse the Kethvar ultimatum. We're not leaving." Dr. Voss's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline.
"Sergeant, I need considerably more information before I can authorize such a decision." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus and his team briefed the colony leadership on their encounter with the gardener. The story sounded impossible even as they told it, but the evidence was undeniable: the advanced technology they had witnessed, the neural resonance fields that had allowed them to understand alien symbols, the subtle changes they could all feel in the ecosystem around them. "So let me understand this correctly," Dr. Voss said when they had finished. "An entity of unknown but clearly vast power has essentially drafted us as participants in some kind of cosmic test of another alien species' moral development. And you think our best response is to openly defy a technologically superior force that has threatened to destroy us?"
"Yes, ma'am. I do." "Why?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because running away won't solve the fundamental problem. The Kethvar will still believe that might makes right, and the next species they encounter might not be as fortunate as we've been. Someone has to draw a line in the sand and say that strength without wisdom isn't real strength at all." "And you think we're strong enough to back up that statement?" "I think we have the potential to be. But only if we're willing to become something more than what we were when we arrived here." Dr. Voss studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing the impossible odds against the even more impossible alternatives. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Sergeant. But if we're going to make this stand, we need to do it right. What do you need?" The final 24 hours before the Kethvar ultimatum expired passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Marcus coordinated defensive positions throughout the colony, taking advantage of the natural barriers provided by New Eden's carefully designed topography. But, more importantly, he worked with Dr. Vasquez and the scientific team to understand the subtle changes that were occurring in the environment around them. The crystal trees were growing taller and more complex, their branches forming geometric patterns that seemed to focus and amplify energy. The rivers had altered their courses slightly, creating a network of channels that flowed in mathematically precise spirals around the colony. Even the weather had changed, with winds that moved in patterns that suggested conscious direction rather than natural atmospheric phenomena. The gardener had promised that the garden would provide tools, and it was becoming clear that those tools were already taking shape around them. But understanding how to use them would require a level of cooperation and coordination that humanity had rarely achieved, even in its most desperate hours. As the deadline approached, Marcus stood in the colony's command center and opened a channel to the Kethvar fleet. Commander Thelnara's voice crackled through the speakers with the same arrogant certainty it had carried 3 days earlier. "Sergeant Chen, have you reached a decision regarding the gardener's ultimatum?" Marcus keyed the transmitter, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Commander Thelnara, we have indeed reached a decision. The New Eden colony respectfully declines your demand for evacuation. This world has become our home, and we intend to remain here." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When Thelnara's voice returned, it carried a note of what might have been surprise. "You understand that this means war, Sergeant Chen?" "I understand that this means you'll have to choose what kind of people you want to be, Commander. The same choice every species faces eventually.
You cannot hope to stand against the might of the Kethvar Alliance with your primitive weapons and handful of colonists. Marcus looked around the command center at the faces of the men and women who had chosen to trust him with their lives. Dr. Voss stood at his shoulder, her expression calm and resolute. Dr. Vasquez monitored the environmental sensors that tracked the garden's growing transformation. Lu Wei managed communications with the defensive positions scattered throughout the colony. Each of them had chosen to be here, chosen to take this stand despite the overwhelming odds.
Commander, you're right that we can't match your technology or your numbers. But you're wrong about what we can hope to achieve.
We're not fighting to destroy you, we're fighting to become the kind of people who deserve to inherit the future.
The alien fleet began its descent toward New Eden's surface 18 hours later.
Marcus watched from the command center as dozens of ships entered the atmosphere, their dark hulls gleaming in the light of the binary suns. They moved with mechanical precision, taking up positions that would allow them to surround and isolate the human colony. But, as the Kethvar forces approached, the garden began to respond in ways that defied every tactical assumption Marcus had formed about their situation. The crystal trees that surrounded the colony suddenly blazed with inner light, their branches weaving together to form a network of energy that crackled through the air like visible electricity. The carefully positioned rivers began to glow with the same ethereal radiance, creating geometric patterns that pulse with power drawn from sources Marcus couldn't identify. Energy readings are off the charts, Dr. Vasquez reported from her position at the sensor array. Whatever's happening out there, it's operating on principles that our equipment can barely detect, let alone measure. The first Kethvar ground forces landed approximately 2 kilometers north of the colony, their armored vehicles emerging from transport ships with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers. Marcus estimated roughly 200 troops, supported by energy weapons and defensive systems that looked decades ahead of anything in humanity's arsenal. But, as the alien soldiers began their advance toward the colony, the garden's defenses revealed themselves. The purple grass beneath their feet began to glow, and, suddenly, the ground itself became an enemy. Roots like living cables erupted from the soil, entangling vehicles and pulling soldiers down into earth that opened and closed like a living mouth. The crystal trees turned their branches toward the invaders and released focused beams of energy that bypassed conventional armor as though it didn't exist. "This is impossible," Commander Thelnara's voice crackled over the communication channel, the arrogant certainty replaced by confusion and growing alarm.
"Sergeant Chen, what are you doing? These attacks are coming from the planet itself."
Marcus keyed the transmitter, watching through the command center's displays as the Kethvar advanced ground to a halt in the face of opposition they had never imagined.
"Commander, we're not doing anything. We're just choosing not to run away."
The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The Kethvar forces were technologically superior to anything humanity could field, but they were completely unprepared to fight a planet that actively opposed their presence. Every step forward became a struggle against terrain that shifted beneath their feet, against trees that turned into living weapons, against an ecosystem that had been transformed into the ultimate expression of defensive warfare. But, more than that, Marcus could see through the tactical displays that the garden was being careful not to inflict unnecessary casualties. Vehicles were disabled rather than destroyed, soldiers were captured rather than killed.
Even as it defended itself, the planet was demonstrating the principle that strength without wisdom was ultimately self-defeating.
The turning point came when Commander Thelnara herself landed in a personal craft, apparently intent on taking command of the failing assault. As her ship touched down on the glowing grass near the colony's perimeter, the very air around her seemed to shimmer and change. Marcus watched in fascination as the Kethvar commander stepped out of her craft and, suddenly, froze, her weapon falling from nerveless fingers as she stared at something only she could see. "All units, cease fire," her voice came over the communication channel, but it sounded different now, uncertain, thoughtful. "All units, withdraw to minimum safe distance and await further orders."
Marcus opened a channel to the Kethvar commander. "Commander Thelnara, are you all right?"
When she replied, her voice carried the same note of awe that Marcus remembered from his encounter with the gardener.
"Sergeant Chen, I need to speak with you. Face to face."
Against the advice of Dr. Voss and his security team, Marcus left the protection of the colony and walked out to meet Commander Thelnara in the no man's land between the human settlement and the Kethvar positions. She was waiting for him near her grounded craft, and he was struck by how human she appeared despite her obvious alien heritage. Tall and graceful, with features that were sharp and angular but undeniably intelligent, she looked like someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. "Commander," Marcus said as he approached, his hands empty and visible.
"Sergeant."
She studied his face with the same intensity he had seen in Dr. Voss's clinical examinations.
"The entity you encountered, the gardener, it spoke with me as well. What did it show you?"
Thelnara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze focused on something beyond the horizon. "My world, as it was before we achieved interstellar travel. Before we became convinced that our way was the only way worth preserving." She looked back at Marcus, and he could see something that might have been pain in her alien features.
"We were not always as we are now, Sergeant Chen.
Once, we too struggled with the questions that define a species' character."
"What happened?"
"We chose fear over growth. When we encountered other species, we saw them as threats to be eliminated rather than opportunities to learn something new. We became what we are today because it felt safer than risking the uncertainty that comes with real change." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him like cold water.
"And now you're being asked to make that choice again."
"Yes. But, this time, I think I understand what we gave up when we chose the easier path." Thelnara gestured toward the colony behind him, toward the crystal trees that still glowed with protective energy.
"Your people faced annihilation rather than abandon their principles.
They chose to stand for something greater than their own survival."
"What will you do now?"
Thelnara was quiet for a long time, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Marcus recognized from his own moments of fundamental decision. "I will return to the Alliance Council and report that this system is under the protection of an entity far beyond our ability to challenge. That will buy your people time to establish themselves more firmly here. But, more than that, Sergeant Chen, I will recommend that we begin the process of re-evaluating our fundamental assumptions about how advanced species should interact with younger ones." She extended her hand toward him, and, after a moment's hesitation, Marcus took it. Her skin was warm, more human than alien, and her grip was firm with the strength of someone who had made a difficult but necessary choice. "Thank you," she said simply, "for reminding us what we could become if we had the courage to destroy our weak selves." The Kethvar fleet departed New Eden's orbital space 3 days later, leaving behind no trace of their presence except for a formal communication to the colony leadership.
The message, transmitted in the clear on all frequencies, was simple and profound. The Kethvar Alliance recognizes the sovereignty of New Eden and its inhabitants.
This world is under our protection. Marcus stood in the colony's main plaza as the last alien ships disappeared into hyperspace, watching the crystal trees slowly return to their normal configuration. The garden's defensive systems were powering down, returning the planet to its peaceful state, but the changes that had occurred during the crisis remained visible everywhere. New growth patterns in the forests, altered river channels, subtle modifications to the ecosystem that would take years to fully understand. Dr. Voss approached from the direction of the command center, her expression unreadable.
"Sergeant Chen, I owe you an apology."
Marcus turned to face her, genuinely surprised.
"Ma'am? I was wrong about you. About your value to this mission, about your ability to handle the responsibility we placed on you."
She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "More than that, I was wrong about what kind of strength really matters when a community faces an existential threat.
Dr. Voss, none of us knew what we were walking into when we came here. We all did the best we could with the information we had."
"Perhaps. But, you understood something the rest of us missed, that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to accept defeat, even when victory seems impossible." She smiled, an expression that transformed her usually stern features. "I think the gardener chose well when it decided to make this stand through humanity." As the days passed and life in the colony settled into new routines, Marcus found himself thinking often about the lessons embedded in their encounter with the Kethvar. The galaxy was vast and full of species at different stages of development, each one facing the same fundamental choice between growth and stagnation, between wisdom and mere strength. Humanity had been given a chance to demonstrate what they had learned from their own failures, their own wars and conflicts and moments of moral crisis. They had proven that a species could evolve beyond its worst impulses, that strength rooted in wisdom was ultimately more powerful than strength rooted in fear. But, more than that, they had learned that the universe was not an empty stage where civilizations performed in isolation. There were entities like the gardener, consciousnesses so advanced that they had transcended individual existence while retaining their commitment to nurturing growth in others. There were species like the HFY, struggling with the same questions that had once nearly destroyed humanity. And there were countless other forms of life, each one carrying the potential to contribute something unique to the greater garden of existence. 3 months after the crisis, Marcus received a personal communication from Commander Thelnara. The message was brief but significant. The HFY Alliance Council had voted to establish a new set of protocols for first contact with developing species, protocols based on cooperation rather than domination. It was a small step, but it represented the beginning of a fundamental change in how one of the galaxy's major powers chose to interact with the rest of the universe. That evening, Marcus walked alone through the crystal forest that surrounded the colony, listening to the soft music of wind through translucent branches and thinking about the journey that had brought him to this place. From a broken soldier medicating his trauma on a distant moon to the man who had helped his species take its first real step toward galactic citizenship, it was a transformation that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The gardener had spoken of the need to destroy the weak self in order to become something greater, and Marcus now understood that this was not a one-time process but a continuous choice. Every day offered new opportunities to choose growth over comfort, wisdom over expedience, courage over fear. The path forward would never be easy, but it was a path worth walking. As he reached the heart of the forest, where the crystal trees grew tallest and their light was brightest, Marcus felt a presence that was both familiar and eternally mysterious. The gardener did not appear in physical form, but its consciousness touched his mind with the gentle weight of vast wisdom and infinite patience. "You have learned well, Marcus Chen. Your species shows great promise." "We had a good teacher," Marcus replied, speaking to the stars that shone through the crystalline canopy above. "What happens now? Now you grow. You learn. You help others to learn. The garden is vast, and there is room for all who choose to tend it rather than exploit it. And if we fail? If we fall back into our old patterns? Then you will have chosen your path, as every species must. But I do not believe you will fail, Marcus Chen. You have already proven that the strong can choose to protect the weak, that the wise can choose to guide rather than dominate. These lessons, once learned, are not easily forgotten." Marcus stood in the alien forest under alien stars and felt a profound sense of peace settle into his bones. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and opportunities that he couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came next, humanity would face it as something more than what they had been when they first set foot on New Eden soil. They had learned to destroy their weak selves. And, in doing so, they had become truly indestructible. The garden would continue to grow, tended by consciousnesses both ancient and newly awakened, shaped by the choices of countless species learning to become more than the sum of their fears and limitations. And, somewhere among the crystal trees and flowing rivers of New Eden, the seeds of that greater future were already beginning to bloom. Marcus smiled and began the long walk back to the colony, to the people who had chosen to trust him with their dreams of a better tomorrow. Behind him, the forest sang with the voice of the gardener, a melody of growth and change and infinite possibility that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. In the end, that was all any of them could hope for, the chance to plant seeds they would never see grow to full flower, to lay foundations for civilizations they would never live to inhabit. But it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.